Welcome, everybody. I would like to give you all a preview of different projects that the Deep State Annex is going to be working on. This is a preview of an awesome Apollo documentary. Sit back and have some fun and watch. Hi, Linda.
Hello.
This is the Deep State Annex, and we
Say hello.
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 All right, now this is how far AI voices have
proudly
come.
present the history of the space race. As World War II drew to a close, a new conflict began to take shape, one between East and West, capitalism versus communism, democracy versus authoritarianism. World War II was the first major conflict where science and innovation played a decisive role, with the advent of the atomic bomb showcasing the power of technological supremacy. The emerging realization was clear. Control of space would mean control of the battlefield. This is the story of the space race. During the Second World War, under the guidance of scientist and engineer Wernher von Braun, Hitler's plans led to the development of the world's first ballistic missile, the V-2 rocket. As the war ended, the United States initiated Operation Paperclip, a program that brought thousands of German scientists to America. Among them was von Braun and his team, who arrived in September 1945, bringing with them 15 tons of paperwork and over 100 V-2 rockets. In the US, von Braun continued to work on the V-2 rocket for the military, enhancing its performance and refining its flight control systems. These rockets, along with the knowledge gained from their development, would later form the foundation of NASA's spaceflight technology. At the end of the Second World War, the Cold War had just begun. Both the United States and the Soviet Union understood that this new conflict would be determined by technological supremacy. With missiles on both sides reaching ever higher altitudes, the struggle for dominance evolved beyond a mere race. It became a fierce competition between two civilizations, capitalism versus communism, the free world versus the unfree world. The ultimate symbol of superiority became the conquest of space. However, the Soviet Union took an early lead. On October 4th, 1957, they launched Sputnik 1 into orbit, marking the world's first artificial satellite. America was stunned. The Soviets had beaten them to the first major milestone. As the Soviet satellite passed overhead every 90 minutes, Americans felt a profound sense of humiliation. The situation worsened just 1 month later when the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, which carried the first living creature into orbit, a small dog named Laika. America responded on December 6, 1957. The United States attempted to launch a satellite of its own, looking to Vanguard, but the mission ended in failure, with the rocket exploding at takeoff. American prestige was on the line. President Eisenhower tasked Wernher von Braun and his team with launching a satellite into orbit within 60 days. On January 31, 1958, Explorer 1 was successfully launched, orbiting the Earth 12 times a day. Later that year, in July, Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, establishing NASA, a new organization that would lead the charge in space exploration technology. With NASA at the forefront, von Braun and his team got to work, and for the first time, it seemed like America could take the lead in the space race. However, on April 12, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth, a triumph that the Soviet Union proudly showcased to the world. Gagarin's achievement was a devastating blow to America's morale, highlighting the successes of the Soviet communist system. Once again, America found itself humiliated, with the weight of the free world resting heavily on the White House. The Soviet Union had not only put a man into orbit, but also launched the largest satellites at the time. The free world was for the first time trailing behind the communist state. Something drastic had to be done. 1 month later, on May 5th, 1961, the United States responded with Project Mercury, launching astronaut Alan Shepard into space as the first American to do so. But that wasn't enough. President Kennedy was determined to prove that the United States, with its ideals of freedom and democracy, could outshine all Soviet achievements. America and the Western world had been the trailblazers of the Industrial Revolution and modern innovation, and they couldn't afford to abandon the legacy that previous generations had worked so hard to build. They had to embark on one of the greatest adventures of all time, and so they would build, experiment, and face failures along the way. Facing the challenges ahead, persevere, and eventually succeed. The American machine was set into motion, and the brightest minds from around the globe were brought together. America was committed to sending a man to the moon, and they were determined to succeed.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too. Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.
Less than a year after Alan Shepard became the first American in space, the words, "Godspeed, John Glenn," became immortalized when the 41-year-old astronaut made history on February 20th, 1962, as the first American to orbit Earth. The Mercury spacecraft, propelled by an Atlas launch vehicle, carried Glenn into orbit, where he circled the planet 3 times. The mission aboard the Friendship 7 spacecraft lasted 4 hours, 55 minutes, and 23 seconds before a successful splashdown in the ocean. While the Mercury program marked significant achievements, new vehicles and technologies were needed to bridge the gap between Mercury and the Apollo missions. Development of a new vehicle for the Apollo missions, directed by Dr. Wernher von Braun, had been in progress for several years. The new launcher, Saturn I, aimed to exceed the heavy lift capabilities of the Russians. It utilized a cluster of narrow tanks, easily manufactured with the tooling from the country's existing rocket fleet, and combined 8 rocket engines to achieve the necessary thrust. The H-1 engine was employed in the development of Saturn I. Engineers altered their approach to mitigate the high failure rates experienced with other rockets. This entailed exhaustive testing of all components prior to launch, including the H-1 engine, which needed to demonstrate 99% reliability. In October 1961, the first Saturn was prepared for flight testing. It featured a massive first stage, a dummy second stage, and a nose cone, all being fueled on the launch pad while technicians meticulously inspected the rocket's subsystems. This labor-intensive process would eventually be overseen by computers, and high-speed film cameras were trained on critical areas of the pad launcher interface, a practice that persists. Although initial tests of new rocket designs were typically fraught with issues, Saturn I executed its maiden flight without a hitch. This marked a modest advance toward President Kennedy's ambitious objective of a manned lunar landing. With both the American public and the U.S. government fully behind Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade, NASA lacked a definitive plan for its execution.
Froze.
I would just like to say hi to everybody. We will
All right.
continue with the documentary. But anyone, any thoughts so far?
It's good. Informative.
It looks great.
Yeah.
Alrighty then.
Of Project Apollo. 2 primary approaches were considered.
Thought you were
Direct
gonna say hi to
descent
everyone.
involving a single large space
Say
Thought you were gonna
again?
Say hi to everyone.
Hello, everybody.
Right,
How
okay.
you doing? And
Craft
welcome.
traveling directly to the moon and back, an Earth orbit rendezvous, which entailed launching two separate spacecraft components into Earth orbit to join and then proceed to the moon. Various
Totally.
designs for these massive spacecrafts were explored. Additionally, a third strategy involving a lunar orbit rendezvous was proposed, necessitating a specialized lunar lander that would be jettisoned post-mission. Langley engineer John Houbolt was a staunch advocate for this method as the viable solution to meet President Kennedy's 1969 deadline. NASA faced considerable technical challenges in July 1961, after Gus Grissom had completed America's second 15-minute suborbital flight. NASA administrators at that time considered the concept of two spacecraft rendezvousing in Earth orbit was daunting, let alone a lunar orbit rendezvous, which was considered outlandish, and the idea was initially shelved. Despite initial dismissal, Houbolt, alongside a team at Langley, had been examining orbital rendezvous challenges since the 1950s and were well versed in the mathematics. Frustrated by the obstruction of his lunar orbit rendezvous proposal from senior management, Houbolt penned a forceful letter to the NASA administrator, arguing that lunar orbit rendezvous was the only feasible approach to achieve the presidential deadline without the Nova rocket. NASA's leadership had to consider that the Nova rocket would have surpassed both the Saturn I and Saturn V in size and power, consuming significantly more resources and constituting a much larger and more complex vehicle. Once Houbolt's theory and calculations were exposed, they underwent rigorous scrutiny. Although initially met with resistance, the soundness of the plan prevailed. Eventually, Wernher von Braun's endorsement led to the adoption of the lunar orbit rendezvous strategy. Following the success of the Saturn I booster test, NASA's path to the moon became clearer. A new group of astronauts, including Neil Armstrong, John Young, and James Lovell, was enlisted. The lunar orbit rendezvous strategy necessitated that a new program would be required before the first mission of Project Apollo. This program evolved into Project Gemini, a beefed-up version of the Mercury capsule designed to carry 2 astronauts. It boasted ejector seats akin to those in a jet fighter and was set to be launched into orbit by an enhanced Titan II missile, which was originally developed to deliver a nuclear warhead. Training for the 2-man missions commenced, aligning with a dense schedule of launches, leading to the cancellation of additional Mercury flights. The Gemini program was established with precise goals. Mastering orbital rendezvous and routine docking with a target vehicle were imperative. It was also understood that any lunar mission would require astronauts to exit the spacecraft and endure the vacuum of space in a pressure suit. New facilities arose at Cape Canaveral, and construction began on a colossal vehicle assembly building for the upcoming Saturn rocket series. In Alabama, a dedicated rocket test site was established, along with new engine test stands in Mississippi. Thanks to Vice President Lyndon Johnson, Texas was set to become the hub of America's space exploration efforts. The newly minted Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, Texas, where a new mission control center was also built. This center would meticulously oversee every aspect of each mission. The Gemini spacecraft represented a significant advancement in capsule design. Mercury astronaut Gus Grissom played a key role in its development, ensuring the pilot control systems were similar to those in the Mercury capsule. The spacecraft featured a corrugated
That was actually a typo, and I need to correct because I used AI to correct the grammar and stuff, and it fucked up. Was that the controls were supposed to mimic a jet fighter?
titanium skin with life support systems and power supply contained in a separate module, which was jettisoned before re-entry. The astronauts had individual hatches and were seated in ejector seats, which allowed for the hatches to be opened and closed in space, enabling spacewalks. The first manned Gemini flight, Gemini 3, launched in July 1965 with Gus Grissom and John Young aboard, completing 3 orbits. 5 hours later, they landed in the Atlantic, west of the Bahamas, 84 kilometers from their intended target. Significantly, Gemini 3 was the first spacecraft to change its orbit, marking a crucial step towards the short-term goal of orbital rendezvous. The flight of Grissom and Young greatly boosted morale for America's space program, and upon their return, they were celebrated as heroes with a ticker tape parade in New York. Following this success, the prospect of a moon landing was taken seriously, culminating in a meeting between the astronauts and President Johnson at the White House. On the morning of June 3, 1965, Gemini 4 was being prepared for astronauts James McDivitt and Ed White, marking their first flight. This mission was the first to be controlled from the new Integrated Mission Control Center in Houston, with launch control remaining at Cape Kennedy. Once the launcher cleared the tower, all aspects of the subsequent Gemini and Apollo flights were managed from Houston. Gemini 4 was NASA's first long-duration flight. An attempt to rendezvous with the Titan upper stage was made but achieved little success, leading to depleted fuel reserves. The exercise was abandoned above Australia. White and McDivitt then donned their spacesuits and began depressurizing the capsule. White struggled with a jammed hatch door, but with McDivitt's help, who understood the problem, it opened, and White stepped outside. He was tethered to the spacecraft by an 8-meter line supplying oxygen for maneuvering. He also had a small zip gun that expelled oxygen. The device worked well but quickly ran low on gas. Due to a communication issue, Mission Control could hear him, but they could not speak to him. Messages had to be relayed through McDivitt. It all seemed deceptively simple, but beyond being outside, White had no specific tasks to perform. The images
Maya.
captured during this mission attracted significant press attention. Gemini 5 was launched in August 1965, marking the first time a spacecraft was powered by fuel cells instead of batteries, allowing for longer flights, although the system encountered issues. Additionally, the spacecraft's thrusters were unreliable, leading the crew, Gordon Cooper and Pete Conrad, to abandon a rendezvous exercise due to a diminished electrical supply and limited control over their craft. Despite these challenges, Gemini 5 set a new endurance record while Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford awaited in their Gemini 6 spacecraft. An Atlas Agena on a nearby pad was prepared for launch. The Gemini capsule was designed for docking, and in October 1965, the first attempt to rendezvous and dock with the Agena target vehicle was scheduled. The Agena's launch was flawless, but after stage separation, radar detected 5 separate objects. The craft had disintegrated. With no point in continuing, and the Gemini program's tight schedule of a launch every 6 weeks, there was no replacement Agena available before the next mission, Gemini 7. The decision was made for Gemini 6, now designated 6A, to rendezvous with Gemini 7, which would launch first, necessitating a rapid turnaround between launches using the same facilities. In December 1965, Frank Borman and Jim Lovell were gearing up for NASA's longest mission yet, planned for 14 days, sufficient for a moon round trip. Gemini 6A was scheduled to launch 8 days after, a procedure Schirra and Stafford had rehearsed just 7 weeks prior, with no faulty target vehicle to hinder them. Cleared for takeoff at T-minus 543, an early plug release triggered an automatic shutdown. The second launch attempt thwarted for Schirra and Stafford. 3 days on, Gemini 6A successfully launched, achieving orbit within 6 hours. The side-by-side rendezvous of the two Geminis was one of the complex maneuvers that needed to be mastered before a realistic attempt at a moon landing could be undertaken. The intricacies of orbital mechanics may have been lost on the American public. The sight of a spacecraft in orbit captured massive media attention once again. Gemini 7 broke the record for time spent in orbit, but in the last few days, it encountered thruster issues. The return to Earth was technically smooth, although Borman and Lovell were physically weakened after their 2-week stint in space. Next up were 2 rookie astronauts, Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott, with Armstrong serving as mission commander and set to become the first American civilian in space. Gemini 8 had an ambitious flight plan. Docking had yet to be accomplished, and this mission aimed to rendezvous and dock with an Agena target vehicle launching an hour prior to Gemini. The launch went flawlessly, and Gemini 8's crew managed to rendezvous and dock with the target vehicle. However, they encountered a thruster issue that caused both docked spacecraft to spin. Armstrong detached the spacecraft, but the spin rate increased due to a stuck thruster on Gemini. As per protocol, an immediate return was initiated. The destroyer Leonard F. Mason retrieved the crew and their capsule from the Pacific, far from the intended recovery zone planned for Gemini 9. Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan were tasked with accomplishing the goals Gemini 8 had missed. Mastering docking was still on the agenda, and in place of the Agena target vehicle, an augmented target docking adapter was launched. It reached orbit, but a concerning indicator lit up on Mission Control's console. When Stafford and Cernan approached their target, they found the ascent shroud still attached. A dispute among contractors led to the usual fitting team being sidelined, resulting in the infamous Angry Alligator. The target was rendered useless, leaving Gemini 9 with nothing to dock with. Moreover, Cernan's spacewalk left him exhausted, soaked in sweat, and struggling with a fogged helmet. In December 1966, John Young and Michael Collins on Gemini 10 had mission objectives very similar to the previous two Gemini flights. They successfully rendezvoused and docked with their Agena target. Then, using the Agena's engine, they boosted their orbit to a new record height. The craft also rendezvoused with the spent Agena used by Gemini 8. Collins conducted 2 spacewalks, during which he lost his camera. As he maneuvered towards the target craft, he found it difficult to secure a grip, experiencing difficulties similar to those of his colleagues on prior flights. Gemini 11 had a 2-second launch window. Pete Conrad and Dick Gordon performed a direct descent rendezvous just 94 minutes after launch. This was the type of rendezvous planned for the Apollo missions. They docked and undocked 4 times, bolstering NASA's confidence in their rendezvous and docking capabilities. Using the Agena's engine, the Link craft reached a record orbital apex of 1,300 kilometers. During an EVA, Gordon attached a tether to the Agena as part of a gravitational experiment. However, the process was again exhausting, more so than simulated exercises on the ground. NASA had just one more Gemini mission to resolve their EVA challenges.
How was that, everybody?
That was good.
Yeah. Yeah.
When he couldn't get a
This
grip on his
is-
spacewalk, I was thinking his suit, his inside of that spacesuit must be browned out.
Well, like,
Yeah,
imagine being the first person stepping outside of a spacecraft. That must
Yeah.
be scary as fuck.
True. I'm traveling at how many thousand miles an hour? 17, is it?
offhand,
not
I
sure.
do not remember. I used to. I've gotten more like that. The finished Apollo documentary, the whole thing is coming soon, circumstances permitting. I already got the script and the audio done for Fukushima Daiichi. I've got the script and the audio done for Chernobyl. The Polygon, which was a Soviet shit show, where they tested their nuclear weapons. I got the script and the audio done for the Manhattan Project and various other things in various other stages. But the video is what I need to get done for the Apollo because I already got that script part. And we're going to have a lot of these coming permitted. The world doesn't end because of Mango Mussolini.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
He's, yeah. Yeah.
The economy's already fucking tanking, isn't it? He's already fucking up. He's got an alleged
Yeah,
paedophile as the Attorney General who's never once stepped in a courtroom. That's a great choice. He's got the anti-vax and 5G dick, Kennedy Jr., in charge of health.
Don't
What a
forget all. don't forget JFK Jr. also hates synthetic fertilizers and pesticides that if without which mankind would starve. So
Yeah.
it's turning into a right shit show.
And
Oh,
junk
and don't
well.
forget. Oh, hey, Dave.
Hey,
And
Dave.
don't forget who he's gonna put in charge of the justice system.
Yeah, Matt.
Somebody
Yeah,
investigated for
Yeah,
uh,
pedophilia.
human trade. Woo!
Human
Like-
trafficking.
Yes, motherfucker. Like, how the fuck? How can you put
I
get
will
that in
tell
your,
you.
like, if he would mix them up, like the person that is like an anti-vaxxer, put them in charge of the justice system, and like the person that's a bit shady in charge of like the medical shit, but like
For those who are just
the
showed up,
worst person at the worst place. Like how?
well, I think that's kind of by design. It's just going to be a shit show. For those
It's
who
all
just
bootlickers.
showed up, we were showing a documentary that this channel is doing. AI is awesome, and AI voice is a labor of love. I think you'll enjoy the documentary.
Yeah, it looks great.
Apollo, then we got a bunch of other ones too. I got the audio done for the other ones. Got to get the video done for Apollo. And how fast things are going to get out depends upon all kinds of stuff. Like I was supposed to be working in Virginia right now, right? But the trucking company that I work for basically does work. It basically transports cans for Anheuser-Busch. Well, Anheuser-Busch did a hiring freeze because they're anticipating a shit show from Mango Mussolini, and there is
Yeah.
real consideration to try to get my family, if I can, out of a shit show central, which is the United States. America, for what America is supposed to be, it's a great country. For what Donald Trump wants to turn it into, that's where the problem lies. The man's compromised by Russia. He's got
Yeah,
Tulsi Gabbard who peddles Russian bullshit. This channel is the smallest channel in all of YouTube that has means of communicating with Starsky, which are not public.
Hmm.
And I think, if I'm correct by some threats made in the comment section, it's also the smallest channel in all of YouTube to make the Kremlin's shit list. I feel honored.
Yeah, yeah. I was watching something on YouTube earlier, and they said like, oh yeah, it was about bad people in history, and like they were like, yeah, if America hates you and Russia hates you, you probably did something wrong. I was like, no, you probably did something probably pretty good if they both hate you. Like, because the only thing America and Russia agree on are things that should not be agreed on. But yeah.
Yeah.
It's,
Wasn't
Or physical science in like, they both agree that the earth is round.
okay, but
just digest
that's I'm not gonna, that's not even a thing that I consider like, oh yeah, that's something you can be not agreeing on. Like I'm like, no, if you don't get that, then like you just don't count. Like yeah,
And
no.
for those who have joined, I was showing a Apollo documentary the channel is working on, and it's almost complete, but I showed what I did have complete. And I think if we want, we should take this conversation to another stream so that people who are coming in don't get confused.
And one thing, stop saying the channel. You're working on it. It's you get all the fucking credit for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You may sometimes ask us like, oh, what do you think of this? And like we may give you a little bit of input, but you're doing all the fucking work. Don't cut yourself
Well,
short.
Thanks. And everyone who's here, if you haven't seen it, go back and watch it. It's completely awesome.
This is the Deep State Annex, and we
It's
proudly present the history of the space race. As World War II drew to a close, a new conflict began to take shape, one between East and West, capitalism versus communism, democracy versus authoritarianism. World War II was the first major conflict where science and innovation played a decisive role, with the advent of the atomic bomb showcasing the power of technological supremacy. The emerging realization was clear. Control of space would mean control of the battlefield. This is the story of the space race.
So everybody, go back and watch it from the beginning. It's truly awesome. We've got a
Yes.
documentary on Fukushima Daiichi coming. We got a documentary on Chernobyl, the Polygon, which again was a Soviet shit show as far as nuclear testing. We got documentaries on the Manhattan Project. All the audio is done for them. So we've got amazing treat regarding uploads. And then we're going to be doing the live streams. We're going back to science, debunking of pseudoscience and promoting of science, some politics stuff. And the pace at which this comes out is the pace at which circumstances in the world allow, because America is about to face some real turmoil. So, everyone, good night, and
Yeah,
may
good
the
night.
force be with you.
Yeah, good night, everyone.
Good night.
Live long and prosper.